Magnificent Obsession by Lloyd Douglas. Chapter 17. When Merrick arrived at his airport shortly after midnight, he slipped out of his dinner clothes and into a dressing gown and told Matsu to toss another chunk of pine on the fire and go to bed. The evening's entertainment had been a gusty symphony, set to every key and tempo, brief passages of ineffable tenderness, momentary measures of hope, drably padded intervals of maneuvering and modulation, spiced with occasional breathtaking crescendos that went ripping shrilly up the chromatic scale, precariously frightened with anxiety. The finale, unfortunately, had brought up on a most disquieting diminished chord. Considering the evening in total, its moods were as fitful and erratic as Sibelius's Valse Triste. He had hoped to bring it to the sportsmanly spirit of an athlete entering upon a rigorous contest. His dear antagonist had promised that nobody, not even he, should be aware of her irritation and resentment, and he knew she would keep her word. If hers would be a difficult part to play, his would be more so. All she had to do was to register cordiality. Whoever, with any social experience at all, had not learned how to dissemble in pretense of amiability when thrown with persons whom one disliked. As for him, the part he had drawn called for a cool casualness, not the stiff restraint of renunciation or a show of aesthetic indifference, but the calm courtesy of a man toward a woman he had barely met. It would be his task to carry this off convincingly, this with a heart aflame. As he gave himself a brief inspection in the cheval glass before starting downtown, he seriously pledged his own reflection that he would maintain an attitude of dignified chivalry toward the woman whose promised pretense of friendship for an evening would probably be little short of torture, and he had seen through almost valorously, all but to the end. And yet, remorseful as he was over that one brief but utter breakdown of self-discipline, which now made their relations more difficult than ever, he tingled to his nerves' ends with memories of those few enchanted moments when, even fully aware that she but kept her contract, her comradeship had seemed sincere. In the mood of a miser, eager to be alone to finger his gold, he impatiently dismissed the solicitously lingering Matsu, lighted his pipe, and eased himself into a deep chair before the crackling fire, determined to live the evening over, item by item, and recover its most stirring sensations. Pursuant to instructions from Joyce, he had called for Nancy Ashford. Regally stunning in crimson, with her youthful face, glistening white hair, superb figure, and resilient step, Nancy was worth all the pride he had in her. He told her so, and she thanked him for that and the flowers. Nothing ever escaped her eye. She remarked, as he helped her into the limousine, that Richard had a new cap and puttees. You haven't had him in uniform before, have you? She inquired. I thought you had some democratic convictions on the subject.
So I had, he admitted, but I've changed my mind. He's part of an institution with his uniform on, and it helps keep him out of mischief. At least, that's the theory. Besides, he likes it.
There had been a lot of rambling chatter like that, to which he had contributed with unusual animation. But Nancy dodged from under the fusillade of inconsequential talk presently, eager to be enlightened. Bobby, she said, as his beautiful new car had swung into the current of boulevard traffic and lengthened its stride. Something tells me this is to be a rather difficult event.
You always were a keen observer, Nancy, he conceded.
Wouldn't it have to be gifted with occult powers to see that the atmosphere at Brightwood this afternoon was heavily charged?
Pardon the interruption, but I like you tremendously in that color. You are very beautiful tonight, dear.
Meaning that you don't want to tell me about it?
Well, perhaps. Something like that.
Very good, then. I shall shut my eyes, ears, and mouth. I am the three wise monkeys. I'll pretend I don't know that you two have had a quarrel.
That's a dear.
And I shall also pretend I don't know that you silly things are so deeply in love you're afraid to exchange glances for fear your secret may be discovered.
I still think you are beautiful, Nancy.
But dumb.
No, not that. Quite exasperatingly to the contrary.
At this she had forgiven him, squeezed his hand, called him dear boy, and for the rest of the trip discussed hospital affairs in a most business-like manner. They stepped out at the Book Cadillac into a big flaked snowstorm and hurried to cover through the revolving doors. Joyce and Helen were awaiting them by appointment on the mezzanine. Joyce almost boisterously gay, swishy and sinuous in some green taffeta confection, wearing the corsage he had sent her, and, unless he was much mistaken, she had tucked a cocktail or two under his orchids, for there was a taut nervousness in her canary gestures and a strident overtone in her voice hardly to be had for less bother than the embarkation of about 3 jiggers of gin. If Helen observed it, she was apparently resolved to ignore it. Seeing it was an occasion for the wholesome ignoring of unpleasant facts, there was probably no reason why she should cavil at this one. What an adorable creature she was, in that black velvet, and the pearls, and his orchids. So she had actually consented to wear them. Score 1 against the beloved enemy. Curiously enough, Joyce, from the first moment, had seemed bent upon hurling them at each other, almost violently. Maybe it was the gin. Perhaps her instinct told her there was some unspoken bond between them which it was her duty to make articulate. Of course, it was always difficult to guess what, how, or whether Joyce was thinking. But, whatever her motive, if she had one, she was at no pains to disguise her intention to make this little party the occasion for a rapid development of their budding acquaintance, as if it were some fungus that must mature now or never. Indeed, she had been utterly ruthless. Over the salad, she had chinked a momentary gap in the conversation by murmuring to herself in exasperatedly stilted style, "Mrs. Hudson, Dr. Merrick, dear me," with a shrug and a sigh. "I had hoped they might be Helen and Bobby by this time." To which Helen replied, leaning toward her in an apologetic maternal undertone, "Drink your milk, little one. There's a good child." They had laughed, their merriment in the nature of applause. The hotel was suffocatingly crowded. Some big trade convention was going on, and the public lounges and foyers were swarming with fussy fat men wearing long blue and gold badges on their lapels, beads of perspiration on their foreheads. Dozens of them were milling about, bound in as many directions, teetering themselves crabwise athwart the current, begging pardons right and left in the tone of "gangway." Their corrugated brows certified that unless they managed to squeeze through, the whole enterprise, after all this trouble and expense, would be futile. Their weary wives sagged in every available chair, conscious of their redundant knees, pecking at fresh morsels with nervous fingers. A few of the more intrepid attempted a languorous indifference towards their unaccustomed cigarettes, which, however, they regarded gingerly and at arm's length, as foolhardy urchins hold sputtering firecrackers, nonchalantly, but with secret concern at the tail of the eye. Joyce had impetuously taken Nancy's arm and led the way. "Keep close, you two," she shrilled over her shoulder, "and don't get lost. We must hurry so we will not be late for the theater," and had swept Nancy along into the squirming pack. Bobby had offered his arm to Helen, and she had taken it, not perfunctorily, but as if she wished to do so. She really needn't have done it. Neither Joyce nor Nancy could observe them. She might have ignored his gesture. It was not necessary she should play a part at that moment. They were jostled in the crowd. He had drawn her closer to him, and she had responded. No, it was not merely that she had pressed against him from without. She had responded. There was a difference. He had drawn her closer to him, and she had responded. He relighted his pipe mechanically and absently held the match until it nipped his fingers. She had responded so generously that he could feel the warm, soft contours of her body against his arm. She needn't have done that. It was not in the book of her play. Yet it was what she would have done if there had been no estrangement between them. Or would she? Probably not. It was hard to think straight about this affair. Until now, no words had passed between them except their brief salutation at meeting, and Joyce's patter had sent them even that into eclipse. He felt he should be saying something to her. He despised all commonplaces, but the silence must not be permitted to grow any longer. Of a sudden, he had become audacious.
I led you this way, once, through a very dark lane, he heard himself saying.
Oh, was it? She laughed. I thought we went hand in hand. I felt like a little girl being led to her first day in the kindergarten.
So, you do remember?
Rather. I don't know what I should have done that night without you. And she had looked into his face and smiled. He wondered if she could feel the pounding of his heart. They were entering the dining room. Joyce waved a hand from a table halfway the length of the room. Tell me something while we're thinking about it, continued Helen confidently. Why didn't you let me drive you home that night, or at least put you down as we passed your gate?
Because I preferred you shouldn't know me. I thought that if you knew, you might... He had broken off lamely, groping for a word.
That was a very appropriate way to begin a friendship like ours, she said crisply, seeing it was destined to be full of little deceits and riddles.
I am sorry, he said.
He must have appeared appallingly so. Well, don't be then, she commanded, hotly, with a savage little tug at his arm. You look like Hamlet. Grin, I tell you. Your Nancy Ashford knows well enough we have been quarreling. I saw it in her face this afternoon. I'm not going to do this farce all by myself. He had looked down into her big blue eyes, amazed at this outburst so startlingly out of keeping with her serene expression, and laughed aloud. As he reviewed it now, he laughed again. It had been absurd, beyond belief. What's the joke? Demanded Joyce as the waiters drew their chairs. Long story, said Helen briefly, and the good man laughed at it once. I can't have him hearing it over again. Nancy looked puzzled. He was secretly pleased over her bewilderment and amused to see that the little episode had put a crimp in her omniscience. Your curriculum is all prescribed, Joyce was saying as the waiters hurried away. All but the dessert. That's an elective. Otherwise, you take what the institution thinks will be good for you. No, darling, she added, turning to Helen, it isn't veal. I remembered that you had already worked off your credits majoring in veal. Do tell us some of your other experiences abroad, Nancy had begged. I'm hoping to go over for a summer presently, and I'm awfully keen on travel trails.
How graciously she had complied, and how charmingly she talked of her impressions. Most of the larger cities he knew almost as he knew his own, but she had seen things that he had missed. Intimate glimpses up narrow streets and into quaint shops where it seems she had frequently made the acquaintance of a whole family. How tenderly she talked about little children. In Assisi, I once made some wonderful friends that way in a little shop, she was saying. I'm afraid I began visiting the Bordinis at first to improve my colloquial Italian. Of course, I always brought some trifle to pay for my tuition, or brought along something for the children, but after a while I found myself going there because I liked them and really needed their friendship. And one day, little Maria, about 3, took dreadfully ill. For 3 weeks she just hung on to the mere edge of life. They were all so terribly worried, and not having anything very important to do, I was in and out frequently through those days. She interrupted her story to unfasten from within the neck of her gown a little silver cross.
Maria's mother insisted on giving me this when I left Assisi."
The trinket was passed around the table. When it came to him, he had inspected it with a feeling of reverence. It was holy, for many excellent reasons.
"I did not want to take it," pursued Helen, "for I'm sure it was the most treasured thing she owned. It had been blessed by the Holy Father himself when, as a young girl in 1900, she had accompanied a pilgrimage to Rome." "So that's why you're wearing that cheap little cross," examined Joyce. "Does it bring you good luck?"
Helen smiled.
"Perhaps," she answered. "At least, I like it better than any other jewelry I have."
"Very naturally," commented Nancy understandingly. Joyce was quite attentive.
"You must have been the family's main prop during the trouble to earn their enchanted cross. Let's have the rest of the story. What all did you do for them while Maria was sick? Help keep store? Was you the nurse? Go on, darling, tell us all about it."
At that point, he had been unable to restrain himself. Quite to his own amazement, he held up a protecting hand. No, Joyce, we really daren't ask Miss Hudson to tell us that." Instantly, he had felt embarrassed by his own remark.
"How funny. Why shouldn't she tell us?"
He had turned to Helen at that and asked soberly, "Did you ever tell anybody that story?"
"No. Now that you ask, I don't believe I ever did."
"Then I wouldn't, if I were you. It's a very valuable little keepsake, and its chief charm is in the fact that nobody knows but you what you did to earn it."
"How perfectly ridiculous, Bobby!" shouted Joyce. "Did you know he was so superstitious, Nancy?"
"I had suspected it a time or two."
Helen was regarding him with perplexed, wide eyes as he put his little fetish into her palm with a gesture that had been perilously close to a caress, for his fingertips had lingered there.
"Sometimes I thought of sending it back to her. You seem to have ideas on this subject, Dr. Merrick. Perhaps you will tell me? Should I?"
"By no means. It wouldn't be valuable to her anymore if she accepted it. She really can't take it back now, you see, because... Helen's lips were parted, and she was a bit breathless as she urged insistently.
"Yes? Because what?"
"Well, because by this time she has probably used it all up herself." She stared at him steadily for a moment as if she had seen a ghost. Then, half articulately, and for his ears only, she murmured,
"So that's what that means."
"Yes, exactly. That's what it means." Her eyes were misty and her fingers trembled as she refastened the little cross inside the neck of her gown.
"I'm glad you told me," she said, under her breath. "I have so often wondered."
Joyce put down both hands with a sudden gesture of impatience.
"What on earth are you people talking about? Do you know Nancy?"
"Oh, vaguely, I think," she replied. "You liked the little towns best, didn't you, Helen? Let's hear some more about them. There was the Bellagio. Tell us about that."
"Oh, do!" echoed Joyce. "You wrote such wonderful letters from there. What was the name of that little hotel on the top of the hill?"
"The Via Serbelloni?"
Helen grew moody.
"Yes, I quite liked it at first, but I grew very lonely there. I became so unhappy I left one afternoon on a moment's impulse in a drenching rain."
"Why, what was the matter, darling?"
inquired Joyce solicitously.
"Just sheer loneliness. The season was over, really, and almost everybody had gone away. There was a young woman I had found congenial, but she turned out to be a writing person, and seeing that was what she was there for, I couldn't impose myself on her when she needed all her time for writing. So, one dreadfully lonely, stormy day, I left."
"Ever see any of her work?" Nancy wanted to know. Helen shook her head.
"Perhaps you should make some inquiries," suggested Joyce. Maybe you figured in some of her tales yourself. Wouldn't it be odd to pick up a story and find oneself cavorting about in it?
During all this Bellagio talk, Helen had addressed herself chiefly to the others. As she replied to Joyce's comment, however, she turned her eyes slowly in his direction. It's quite possible I may have qualified for some minor part in a story, for I had been as garrulous as a high school girl before I discovered her occupation.
I am sure you were the heroine of the piece, he had declared stoutly. I would swear to that.
You seem as certain as if you really knew. She had leaned slightly towards him. Her nearness gave him a chance to mutter, in an undertone, I do. The talk had drifted then to ships. Nancy was anxious to know all about voyages, what to wear, how much and whom to tip, how long in advance one should book passage to ensure good space.
Helen had hers on a day's notice coming back,
remembered Joyce.
But it's not always that way, Nancy argued. I recall a quite hectic experience we had in getting accommodations for some friend of Bobby's who was suddenly required to go to Buenos Aires.
He had glanced apprehensively at Helen and found her staring into his eyes, her brows knitted in perplexity. Quickly collecting herself, she said,
Perhaps the season has something to do with the congestion. When was it? When was it, Bobby? Queried Nancy. You ought to remember you were no end excited over getting him off by that boat. It must have been about a year ago, possibly a little earlier than this.
Something like that,
he had agreed disinterestedly. The waiters had handed them menu cards. Joyce and Nancy had their heads together in consultation over parfait flavors. Helen had raised her card until it screened her face from them. That was very good of you, she said softly. I never guessed, until now.
I didn't intend you should. I hope you will never give it another thought. I'm sorry the matter inadvertently came up.
Her face was studious for a moment, then brightened suddenly with illumination. Oh, I see, she murmured.
I wonder if you do.
She nodded her head vigorously. It is something like my Bordinis and my little cross, isn't it?
Yes, exactly like that.
Joyce had put an end to their cryptic byplay with the demand for light on the dessert problem. It had been a very tender moment, and he mulled it over now, analytically. It occurred to him that he had been called away on some emergency duty at that juncture. He might at this moment be exulting in the hope that their misunderstanding had been definitely cleared. He rose and paced the room, digging his fingertips into his temples, paused at the little table, refilled his pipe, replenished the grate, and sank again into his chair. A small cathedral clock on the mantel wearily tolled the first quarter. Those 4 strokes, when, on occasion, they caught his attention, invariably sent a momentary cloud drifting across his mood. It was not so at the half. The clock seemed to have cheered up noticeably by that time. It was almost reassuring when it came to the third quarter, but always that jaded, resigned, mocking, Amarish da-dee-dee-dum at the first quarter impressed him with the solemn asininity of whatever he happened to be doing and the futility of everything he was planning to do. It was exactly as if eternal destiny stretched its long arms and yawned. He could never be sure precisely what it said. Sometimes the strokes were but 4 gradations of an articulate sigh of inexpressible pleasure, an inexpressible fatigue. The vibration still lingered. He glanced up. It was 15 minutes past 2. He resumed his reflections moodily, realizing that his memories, from this point, would be disturbing. The short trip to the nearby theater had been uneventful, made in his own car. As it drew up at the curb, he had heard Helen exclaim to Nancy, "What a beautiful car! What is it?" He had not caught Nancy's reply, but she knew. They were very late, having lingered long at dinner, gropingly following the usher's little electric torch. They had dodged guiltily into their seats, which fortunately were on the aisle. A nimble chorus marched mincingly across the stage, single file in close formation, like a garish caterpillar, coquetted, shrieked by a piercing blast, broke ranks, and were joined by the male contingent, which sauntered in from the wings. There was a stormy repetition of a theme song, a final deafening screech with arms aloft, and the lights burst on as the curtain fell. Joyce, who had insisted on leading the way, leaned to the left across Nancy and Helen to hand him the seat checks. How vividly every trivial incident stood out now, chiseled in high relief. He had reached for the ticket stubs, his movement pressing him close against Helen's bare shoulder. His hand had lightly brushed her arm. Every chance contact swept him with a suffocating surge of emotion. It was only by the sternest resolution that he had resisted the urge to touch her. He could not remember what the chatter was about at this first entr'acte. Joyce seemed to have provided most of it, some amusing incident of Jasmine's opening night in New York. Nancy was her best listener. Helen, smilingly half attentive, half preoccupied. The orchestra trailed in, twitched its E string. The director raised both hands, swept his crew fore and aft with a final inspection, and they were off at full gallop in the descending darkness. He had wished he was not quite so acutely conscious of her beside him, fearing she might sense the physical outgroping of himself toward her. Nancy's experienced observation recurred to him. He had told her how keenly aware he had been of the girl in the car beside him that night in the country. Nancy had pooh-poohed his naive notion that Helen was, of course, ignorant of his sensations.
"Nonsense," Nancy had scoffed. "Do you imagine she could have that effect on you without sharing it? How little you know about women."
It was near the close of the second act that the catastrophe occurred. He had not been following the silly, threadbare plot with enough attention to realize what, if anything, it was aiming at. His mind had been concentrated on the magnetic presence beside him. What time he was not daydreaming of the happiness he would find in surrounding her with the things she ought to have. It was not until he had irretrievably blundered that he came awake to the fact that he unwittingly insulted her. The dashing Anjouan had returned. It was a colorful scene of a country house party in a luxurious limousine. The fact that she was penniless, that the car was the property of the brazen broker who had been pursuing her throughout the play with gifts and attentions obviously to be credited on account, that the imported gown she wore was his by purchase. All this was of no significance to him. At that moment, the only fact of interest to him was the quite good-looking limousine. Impetuously, he had turned to Helen. Their heads had touched lightly for an instant, and whispered, "I heard you say you liked my new car. I'm not using it much. I'd like to lend it to you for the time you're here." Perhaps, even then, the most serious blunder of all might have been avoided had she been quick with an emphatic refusal, unsuspecting that her silence meant nothing more encouraging than she had been stunned by his raw audacity, and heartened by the misinterpreted silence. He had groped shyly, his heart pounding for the hand that he knew lay palm up, very white against the black velvet. Perhaps she had intuitively divined his attention. Perhaps the slight movement of his arm gave her warning. Or did she choose that exact second to toy with her strand of pearls? He would probably never know how it had happened. The warm velvet stirred uneasily under his brief caress. The curtain was falling. The house was flooded with light. He glanced apprehensively toward her. Her cheeks were flushed, and her little fist, tightly clutching her handkerchief, was pressed hard against her lips. On Joyce's suggestion, they strolled in the lobby. On the way up the aisle, Helen had taken Nancy's arm, and Joyce, observant, had tarried until he fell in step with her. Animatedly, she had carried the full responsibility for the desultory talk. He was glad, for his mind was in chaos. When the signal summoned to the last act, they returned in the order in which they had made their exit, and when their seats were reached, Helen led the way in, leaving Joyce beside him. What a beastly cad she must think him, but surely her own good sense would tell her that he had not meant it. Not that way. He hadn't the faintest idea what the last act was about. sat through it suffering every imaginable torture. After a few eternities, the wretched thing was done. Their parting was brief, conventional, without one single understanding look into each other's eyes. In the morning, he would find her and attempt an explanation. The clock tolled the 4 quarters and struck 3. He had an operation to do at 9. Wearily, he flung off his clothes and went to bed. As he relaxed on his pillow, sick at heart, the chimes offered a cynical comment on his adroit handling of the evening's complicated problem. Upon his arrival at the hospital in the morning, the desk notified him he was requested to call Mr. Randall at the Fourth National Bank, to which he paid no attention. Having finished his operation, he called the Statler and asked for Miss Hudson. She had checked out. Chapter 18. The Bruce McLarens were entertaining Dr. Robert Merrick at luncheon in their cozily furnished apartment. It was Sunday, and the 3 of them were just back from Grace Church, where the appearance of the distinguished young surgeon in the minister's pew, in company with Mrs. McLaren, had excited a genial buzz of pride and satisfaction. Bobby Merrick's recent spectacular contribution to the cause of brain surgery had been made much of by the press, somewhat to his own dismay, for he had the honest scientific worker's shyness of publicity. It had been quite embarrassing to see his invention described in the argot of journalistic ballyhoo, and he was not nearly so grateful as he would have liked to be for the well-intended eulogies on the editorial pages of the dailies and the sentimental twaddle which embellished his biography in the digests and reviews. Of course, it really had been a corking story, well worth its 2-column head on page 1. The scribes had left nothing out. Young Dr. Merrick's utter abandonment of the leisure to which he had access by virtue of his large fortune to give himself tirelessly to the most difficult and discouraging specialty known to surgery was played up for all that the traffic would bear. Had he not promptly barricaded himself against the fleet of feature writers who bore down upon him, the matter would unquestionably have been worse. "You really owe something to your public," one of them had twittered, as if she were talking to some movie-struck flapper who had won the Times Beauty Contest. It was even recalled that Dr. Merrick's life had been saved some years ago at the same hour when another eminent brain surgeon, the late Dr. Wayne Hudson, had drowned in Lake Saginaw. One paper, Pink, had broadly wondered if the wealthy young Merrick's immediate decision to enter a medical school where he trained to espouse brain surgery might have been influenced, if not directly caused by, that tragedy. But, lacking the details and unable to twist them out of the unhappy hero or his associates, it had been content to toss out the hint and let the public draw its own conclusions. Within 18 hours after the news broke, Bobby had decided that if the liabilities of front-page publicity were pitted against the assets accruing therefrom, his account with fame was already in the red. It was obvious that a new star was better off for a low visibility. His mail was crammed with importunities from every known species of beggars, appeals from alleged philanthropies ranging all the way from foundations guaranteeing international understanding to wildcat altruistics for the relief of hectored blue jays. He was the recipient of home-brewed poetry extolling his merits, slobbering songs hymning his praise and hopeful of publication at his expense, saccharine love letters, many of them enclosing photographs. He was besieged for luncheon talks. He became a fugitive, darting from cover to cover. Even out at Windermere, where he sought seclusion for a weekend, shortly after the persecution set in, he was exasperated to find his grandfather proudly and, for him, garrulously accommodating a severely tailored young woman who required some intimate knowledge of Bobby's boyhood to adorn a magazine story.
"Oh, Robert, surprised to see you," exclaimed old Nicholas. "We were just speaking of you. This young lady."
"Yes, I see," Bobby had responded icily. "I dare say she will pardon us if we change the subject."
"That I will not,"
giggled the visitor. Nicholas had looked very foolish and helpless over the situation until Bobby came to his relief by summoning Meggs. "Tell Stephen to drive this lady down to the station, Meggs. She is anxious to make the 4:16. As for his colleagues in the profession, their gratitude and generous felicitations had been a source of much pleasure. Every day brought dignified encomiums from well-known men of his own speciality, thanking him for the unselfish manner in which he had promptly made his find available to his fellows. He had had letters from every civilized country of the world. Not that sufficient time had elapsed for his sudden fame to jellify. Bobby had shyly crept out into the open to resume his normal schedule of activities and recreations. He had not yet become accustomed to the stares, whispers, and nudges which singled him out in public places. But, seeing he couldn't sneak about forever like a haunted thing, he masked his self-consciousness the best he could, and took his punishment with an assumption of nonchalance. Today he had even risked going to church. Dr. McLaren had preached a scholarly sermon to a large audience of good-looking people, fully half of whom were under 40, on a topic he hoped would be of special interest to his important guest. Indeed, what Dr. Robert Merrick was going to think of that sermon had loomed so large in the popular young preacher's mind, while preparing his discourse, that it was with much difficulty he had restrained himself from use of a scientific phraseology quite beyond the ken of his customers, albeit, as church audiences went, they intellectually registered A+, and freely admitted it. Grace Church was quite conscious of its modernity. Really, the most forward-looking, indeed, the only forward-looking church in town, Mrs. Seelbach was remembered to have said in prefacing her suggestion to Dr. McLaren as the proper person to invoke the divine blessing on that session of the Social Congress which had programmed a discussion of birth control.
As to what?
President of the Social Congress, Mrs. Cordelia Kunz of Grand Rapids, had inquired dryly, tapping her notes with a cunning little lorgnette.
Forward-looking on economic questions, social problems, political issues, or merely posing as the last outpost of orthodoxy?
Mrs. Seelbach, slightly dizzied and not a little netted, had replied that she was sure she didn't know exactly how far or in what direction Grace Church led the way to freedom, and snapped her purse several times, quite noisily, to emphasize her disclaimer of future interest in the matter, aware that the brusque gavel-swinger from upstate had indeed touched a mighty live wire. Obedient to the necessary precautions, however, Dr. McLaren had made a few last-minute substitutions for certain erudite terms he feared might overshoot his congregation. But even with these begrudged alterations in the cause of clarity, the address was as one scientist to another, and the people who heard it were at once flattered and befuddled by its charming inexplicability. They, too, wondered what Dr. Robert Merrick thought of it, and all were glowingly proud of their wise young pastor. And they had every right to be proud. The Reverend Bruce McLaren, Ph.D., was by no means an intellectual coxcomb or a solemn blatherskite with a fondness for big words and an itch to achieve the reputation of a savant. His scholarship was sound, and the sermon that morning was a credit to it. Deacon Chester, warmly gripping his pastor's hand, shouted above the shrill confusion of the metal-piped postlude that he guessed it was the most profound sermon ever delivered in Grace Church. The statement was entirely correct, nor was the word guess used in this connection a mere colloquialism. Had Mr. Chester been a painstaking stylist, he was a prosperous baker of cookies by the carload lot, and not averse to admitting that he had left school at 13. He could not have chosen a word more meticulously adequate than guess to connote his own capacity to appraise the scholarship disclosed by that homily. Had a photographic plate been exposed to Mr. Chester's knowledge of the subject which Dr. McLaren had treated it, it could have been used again, quite unimpaired, for other purposes. The warm friendship which had arisen between Dr. McLaren and Dr. Merrick dated from a raw March evening when the rangy, bronze-haired preacher had been brought into Brightwood unconscious and breathing stertorously with an ugly and dangerous smash in the right squamous temporal. He was muddy, bloody, and limp. It had looked black for him that night, and the only recess Dr. Merrick had permitted himself, from the time he finished the necessary repairs at 9 until the next morning at 7, were brief pacings up and down the corridor in front of his important patient's door, tugging nervously at cigarettes and disinterestedly accepted the sandwiches and milk brought up by a nurse at 3. Bobby Merrick had liked McLaren from the first moment. Liked the length and strength of him as he lay on the operating table, subconsciously making his good fight for life. Liked the shape of his broad forehead, the cut of his ears, the cleft of his chin, the hardness of his well-tennised right forearm, the texture of his hide, the elliptical curve of his thumb. All these things were significant. Had Dr. Merrick been required, he could have written a 2,000-word paper on the character of Dr. McLaren before he had ever heard him speak. He had liked his patient, next day, for the inherent poise he had exhibited when, rousing for the first time to a vague consciousness of his surroundings, he had taken in the situation at a glance and, apparently considering it as all in the day's work, had dropped off to sleep at the nurse's suggestion without bothering to ask questions. Bobby had liked him even more a few days later for his quite superior capacity to take his punishment, and there was a lot of it, without flinching or grousing. And finally, he had liked Dr. McLaren's state of mind when, a week after the accident, he had spoken calmly and without rancor of the drunken insolvent who had run him down in a safety zone.
"He probably feels bad enough about it," remarked McLaren, in his deep bass mellowed by an ancestral Scotch burr. "Anyway, I'm not going to press the matter or make myself wretched by mulling it over." "That's amazingly good sense," Merrick had commented, privately resolving to see more of this man when he was up and had his boots on. He had never known a preacher before. His rather nebulous opinion of clergy had been collected from cartoons, the quips and jibes of paragraphers, and satirical sideswipes at the profession roughly projected from the stage and screen. He had lately thumbed, scowlingly, a nasty novel vilifying men of this vocation. He was not conscious of an active dislike for them, but shared what seemed to be the unchurched public's general belief that preachers were, to put the matter laconically, a bunch of saps. Every day, the young surgeon found himself more and more pleasantly attracted by his patient, enjoyed his droll comments, offered in moments when drollery came high, admired the adroitness with which he parried the friendly raillery of doctors and nurses, chaff invited by his own whimsical humor. Almost everybody in the organization at Brightwood was in to see him at one time or another during his convalescence, and it was quite unanimously held that he was a good sport. And no less cordially interested had been the Brightwood household in the brown-eyed, deep-dimpled Mrs. McLaren, who had appeared anguished but admirably controlled a half hour after her husband's arrival. They had telephoned her that Dr. McLaren was seriously injured, suggesting that she come at once. When she came, there was no hysteria. Would Dr. McLaren recover? They couldn't say. It was too soon to tell. He was very, very badly hurt. She took the blow standing, and they rejoiced in her pluck. She was invited to stay the night, and they were at pains to give her every scrap of available information about her husband, both good and bad. From the first, Mrs. McLaren was adopted at Brightwood on unusual terms. When Dr. Merrick told her at noon that her husband was putting up a very encouraging resistance and had at least an even break in the decision, she did not stage a scene. There was a momentary tight closing of her eyes, a brief quick breath of relief, and a misty smile, but no theatricals. She had herself well in hand. Bobby liked her for that. He was glad to have her about. Sometimes when her husband was asleep, she would read to other convalescents. On several occasions, she offered first aid to hysterical next-of-kins, who waited while operations of interest to them were in progress. One day, upon invitation of Dr. Pyle, she went into the operating room to see some interesting surgery, from which entertainment she hastily excused herself, however, when a diminutive saw began making noises that played the deuce with her digestion. The McLarens were, by popular suffrage at Brightwood, all to the good.
One afternoon, the Reverend Bruce said to Dr. Merrick, as the latter sat by his invalid chair visiting, not very professionally, but with the hope of hearing a few more Scotch stories.
Beloved, I'll be out of here soon, and I'm just a bit anxious about my bill. My income is small, and at my present balance at the bank, if there is one, would amuse you. Of course, I know what the hospital charges are, and I can manage to pay them, but I've been afraid to ask about your fee, thinking perhaps the shock wouldn't be good for me. Speaking of the Scotch, what are you going to charge me?
Well, I'll make you a proposition, Dominie. You've given me a chance to pat your head. I'll give you a chance to do something for my soul, and we'll call it square. I'll take it out in trade. How's that?
That's mighty generous, rumbled McLaren, in a tone set at least 3 added lines below the bass clef. I'll expect you to come in and attend my church soon as I'm in the running again.
Oh, do I have to go to your church for this treatment?
Well, I came to your hospital, didn't I, for mine?
You win, said Bobby submissively. I'll be there. Pursuant to his promise, he had gone to Grace Church on that fine May morning. After having telephoned the McLarens he was coming, and having accepted their invitation to return with them to their apartment afterwards for luncheon. Betty McLaren had quite enjoyed the sensation of presenting him to many of their friends. She had been very proud of Bruce's performance in the pulpit. She was having a good day. Would Dr. Merrick have 2 lumps or 3, cream or lemon? And wasn't he surprised to see how many young people in the congregation? Dr. Merrick would have 1 lump, neither cream nor lemon, and was it anything to be surprised at that young people went to church?
Oh, quite,
replied Dr. McLaren, helping his guest to a portion of the delicious omelet.
That's our one great satisfaction. You see, the students of the young business and professional people have outgrown the old traditions and are eager for, shall I say, intellectual approach to religion. We've been trying to give it to them.
I noticed that, said Bobby. Your sermon was very scholarly, and they liked it, I am sure.
Well, Doctor, if you don't mind being healthily candid with me, exactly how did it strike you as a scientist?
Oh, I'm not much of a scientist. A surgeon doesn't have to be a scientist, just a good mechanic.
Betty McLaren protested with a laugh. Come now, Dr. Merrick. The very idea, you not a scientist. We know better than that. At all events, you have the scientific outlook, the scientific approach, insisted Dr. McLaren. Perhaps you noticed at what pains I was to avoid the old stock phrases of theology.
I fear I wouldn't recognize them as such, confessed Bobby. But what's the matter with the old terminology?
Obsolete. Misleading. We'll have to evolve a new vocabulary for religion to make it rank with other subjects of interest. We're got to phrase it in modern terms. Don't you think so?
Dr. McLaren was eager for his guest's approval. Perhaps, agreed Bobby, tentatively. I don't know whether people could learn any more about religion by changing its names for things of concern to it. I'm not sure. Just occurs to me, casting about at random for a parallel case, that the word electricity means amber. All that the ancients knew about electricity was that a chunk of amber, when rubbed with silk, would pick up a feather. Now that it has been developed until it will pick up a locomotive, electricity still means amber. They never went to bother and change the name of it. Maybe they thought that there was at least a pleasant sentiment in retaining the name. More likely, they never thought about it at all. Too busy trying to make it work, I suppose.
Huh! That's a new idea. Then you think it doesn't make much difference about the phraseology of religion?
It wouldn't, to me, replied Bobby, hoping he had not too ardently objected to a pet theory of his host.
Well, there seems to be a demand for a more adequate interpretation of theology. We are trying to be a little less dogmatic in our assertions and a little more honest. For instance, I
think it's ever so much better to say frankly that God is a hypothesis than to attempt to offer proofs which fail to stand up under their own ponderosity. Bobby was tardy with a rejoinder, and both McLaren silently quizzed him out of the tails of their eyes. Surely at least to believe in the deity as a hypothesis. He observed that they waited.
I'm afraid I don't accept that, he said at length, rather shyly.
Oh, Dr. Merrick, reproved Betty disappointedly, you don't mean to say that you do not believe in God at all?
I mean that I do not think of God as a hypothesis.
But, my dear fellow, exclaimed McLaren, we really have no hard and fast proofs, you know.
Haven't you? Asked Bobby quietly. I have. The two forks in use by the McLaren family were simultaneously put down upon their plates.
How do you mean, proofs? Queried his host.
Bobby wished then that he had smilingly deferred to the minister's theory. He had no relish for controversy, and this was no place for it. Had he been no end a debater? Moreover, he knew he was not in a position to explain what he had called his proofs. Lamely, he admitted that he had considered sufficient evidence for the existence of God might satisfy no one but himself. He privately hoped the conversation might soon find safer going.
You're probably arguing from design, McLaren suggested bookishly.
Oh, probably, said Bobby, with a gesture of dismissal.
The whole business of institutionalized religion, resumed McLaren didactically, demands reappraisal. It appalls me to contemplate what must be in the future of the church when all the people who are now 50 and are up in the graves, this oncoming generation, now in its adolescence, is not in the least way concerned about organized religion. Religious enough instinctively, I dare say, but out of sorts with the sex, weary of their bad-mannered yammering at one another over matters in which no one's guess is as good as another's, and no outcome promised either in faith or conduct, no matter whose guess is right.
Is it that bad? Commented Bobby. I hadn't known the churches were losing ground. There seems to be a lot of them.
Yes, too many, grumbled McLaren. Too many. Of the wrong kind. Takes so important a matter now as the nature and mission of Christianity's author himself. A Christ who can help us to clearer perception of God needs to be personally confronted with problems similar to ours, and solving them with knowledge and a power to which we also have access, else he offers us no example at all. But here we have a majority of the churches trying to elicit interest in him because he was supernaturally born, which I wasn't. But he turned water into wine, which I can't. Because he paid his taxes with money found in a fish's mouth, which, for all my Scotch ingenuity, I can't do. Because he silenced the storm with a word and gesture, whereas I must bail the boat. Because he called back from the grave his friend who had been dead 4 days, while I must content myself with planting a rose bush, calling it a closed incident. What we want is a Christ who serves to us, in leading us toward God, is not predicated upon our dissimilarities, but upon our likenesses. In our church, we're trying to offer a Christ who is not a mere prestidigitator, a magician who feeds an acre of people from a boy's lunch basket, but a great prophet and an understanding friend. Do you think a man can accept that and still be a sound scientist? Bobby accepted a light from his hostess's hand and slowly nodded.
I know very little about the conflict between the traditional estimate of Christ and the more recent theory. Viewing it superficially, I should say that neither system would appeal very strongly to this age. Isn't the modern school just substituting a new metaphysic for the old one? One generation is doing all its thinking in terms of power, energy, dynamics, the kind you read about, not in a book, but on a meter, Why not concede the reality of supernormal assistance to be had under fixed conditions and encourage people to go after it?
That sounds a little as if you believed in prayer, Dr. Merrick, said Betty wistfully.
You mean getting down on your knees to wish you had something?
No, it's more than that. Asking God to give it to you.
Well, that depends on your credit.
Agreed, nodded McLaren.
I'm afraid I don't quite understand, said Betty.
Why, he means that unless one has been living up to one's best ideals, it's useless to ask for God's approval and assistance. That's obvious.
No, said Bobby. That's not what I meant. If you're interested, I'll tell you a story. For the next 2 hours, they had moved to the library on Bobby's hint that they had let themselves in for an extended tale. The McLarens sat scarcely daring to trust their own hearing. Eager to give them all the steps of his spiritual progress in their exact sequence, he had begun back in Randolph's studio. Carefully picking his way with care to the avoidance of any act of his own, performed in pursuance to the Galilean theory of availing prayer, he laid the facts before them in a dispassionate recital. He finished as he had begun. He could hardly expect them to believe it, he said. He hadn't believed it, had been disgusted by it, intellectually offended by it, in violent revolt against it, but, well, there it was. How utterly trivial, said McLaren humbly.
My whole program of preaching seems in the face of such astounding possibilities. Why, we've been trying to teach religion without knowing what it's all about.
No, I shouldn't go so far as to think that, consoled Bobby. You've inspired people to take stock of themselves. They can't help being better for every serious thought you've given them about life and duty. That's ethics. And ethics is decidedly important. This thing I've been talking about is not in the field of ethics. It belongs rather to science. We've been at great pains to construct devices and machinery to be energized by steam and electricity and sunshine, but haven't realized how human personality can be made just as receptive to the power of our major personality.
I feel today, said McLaren, as if I'd been doing nothing. Exactly nothing.
By no means. You've been doing some highly necessary work in clearing away the old superstitions, the old irrelevancies. That's not labor lost, you may be sure. Only, as I listened this morning, I couldn't help wishing that this new interpretation of religion, which you're so splendidly equipped to offer, might go further and show how soundly scientific religion is. You counseled us today to accept the evolutionary hypothesis. You said, if I recall correctly, that we could explain everything we have and are by that theory. Now, I don't agree with you. Perhaps our bodies derive some pre-human type of life. Perhaps all romantic literature is but an elaboration of the animal's urge to reproduce itself. Perhaps our brains are but refinements of elementary nerve ganglia that used to respond automatically to the necessity for food and shelter. It hasn't been proved. You were ever so much more sure of it in your pulpit than my biology professor was in his classroom. But, assuming a physical evolution, biology has no explanation to offer for human personality. You ask old man Harper how he accounts for aspiration, penitence, inquisitiveness about our origin, concern about our future, and he'll say, I'm not a theologian, sir, I'm a biologist.
And, I suppose you're hinting, smiled McLaren, that my chief business is to account for aspiration, penitence, and a man's passion to be a time binder? And if anybody inquires what I think about evolution, I'd better reply, I'm not a biologist, sir. I'm not a theologian.
Something like that, agreed Bobby.
I wonder if we are modernists, said McLaren, after a considerable pause, are not somewhat in the predicament of Moses.
who had enough audacity to lead the slaves out of their bondage, but lacked the ingenuity to take them on into a country that would support them. We've emancipated them, but they're still wandering about in the jungle, dissatisfied, hungry, making occasional excursions into paganism and experimenting with all manner of eccentric cults, longing for the spiritual equivalent of their repudiated superstitions, sometimes even wishing they were back in the old harness.
It's worthwhile to fetch them out of that, said Bobby. It ought to be equally interesting to lead them on. They mustn't go back, but they will, if they're not pointed to something more attractive than the jungle you say they're in.
As he left the house at 4, McLaren followed him out of to his big coupe parked at the curb.
"Merrick," he said rather timidly, "would it be asking too much of you come to my church again next Sunday? I'm going to have something a little more constructive to offer, and I'd like your reaction."
I would gladly, but I shall be on the briny deep, sailing Saturday to France, en route to Vienna to see a colleague. I'll be happy to come when I return. He stepped on the starter and the powerful engine hummed. McLaren gripped his hand.
"Merrick, just a minute. We modernists have been trying to show our religion is not at odds with science. What we've got to do now is show how religion is a science. Isn't that what you mean?"
Exactly. Nothing less or else than that. You have it. More power to you. See you in September. Chapter 19.
Maxine Merrick, pouring their coffee in the sunny breakfasted room of her over Louise department in a boulevard Haussmann near the Etoile, glanced up shyly at her distinguished guest, finding it difficult to identify him as her son. Her mouth was somewhat different. Ungifted with any capacity for character analysis, she was unable to define the change, but some dormant instinct told her it was other than merely functional. It was organic, structural. It was not an austere mouth, neither was it pessimistic, but it had put off its adolescent wistfulness. It no longer entreated or anticipated or even inquired. It accepted. The mouth had none of the tight-buckled smugness of self-imputed infallibility, none of the haughty protrusion of authority and repose, but it looked as if it were concerned only with facts and had learned to be very particular about them. If they had really been shown to the facts, the mouth accepted them, let the facts be fair as a May morning or ugly as sin. And his eyes were somehow different. They seemed deeper set, not as if they had winced but retreated from sights they had found disagreeable. Experienced eyes that were used to looking at suffering, but not without great cost to themselves. They were not sad or weary eyes, but one felt that they had seen so much they would not again widen readily with surprise. They did not cynically defy you to startle them, but you knew there was nothing you would be likely ever to say or do that would make them blink with amazement. There was difference in his hands. Same long, slender artist fingers, but they had left off groping uncertainly for things. They had achieved a sureness, a poise, a confidence, not to be had at less expense than the honest, tireless, discriminating experience of dealing with facts. Let the facts be no end unpleasant. In short, they were the mouth, eyes, and hands of a surgeon. Bobby's decision to go in for a profession had failed to impress her favorably. Beyond a feeling, which she tardily and peevishly expressed, that he was enslaving himself unnecessarily, she had been left unstirred by his resolution. His completion of his medical course evoked only a request that now he was finished with school, she dared say he would be able to run over and spend the summer with her. Later, when she had settled to the routine of an occupation demanding a devotion all but cloistral, she confided to her intimates how unfair it was that he should give his life to strangers, when his own widowed mother stood in such desperate need of him. Her infrequent notes, and purple ink and big sprawling letters, blubbered with self-pity and petulant accusations of indifference, but her mileage was about as good as ever, and she was rarely alone except when asleep. When, however, it had been called to her attention, she never read the journals or reviews herself, that a young Dr. Merrick of Detroit, could it possibly, her informant wondered, be her own Bobby, had been making himself famous by the invention of a remarkable surgical instrument, her pride knew no limits. Suddenly aware that she had sacrificially offered him years ago on the altar of humanitarian service, and had been waiting hopefully for the day when her unselfish renunciation of her maternal claims on him might be publicly recognized, Maxine hastened to collect the tribute due her valiant and uncomplaining martyrdom, inviting all and sundry to view the stake whereupon she had sizzled through the long days when her faith and hope were under fire. For the space of a week she romped about among her acquaintances, accepting with happy tears their high-key chirps of felicitation, and cabled a mawkishly sentimental message to her son which fervently thanked the good God for making all her wonderful dreams come true, and cost her 415 francs. This morning Maxine lacked but a decade of looking her age, and felt even closer to it than she appeared. At no little cost she had planned the brilliant luncheon she was giving today at 2, when Bobby was to triumphantly be exhibited to a half-dozen young old ladies, mostly self-exiled Americans who had either outlived, outgrown, or outworn their relatives, and as many modish or musty old gentlemen with gray mustaches and ginny breaths. She had been bland with her statement that they were exceptionally favored by this invitation to meet her boy prodigy, and privately hoped he had matured sufficiently to justify the story of his wide distinction. It had not occurred to her that he would return to her with that kind of a mouth, those eyes, those hands, which accused her of being not a day under 56. Accustomed to playing roles on short notice, suggested by her own volatile caprices, she determined to meet this awkward circumstance on its own ground. She would enjoy being the mother of a lion, even if the fact that the lion was no longer a cub would make it difficult for her to be quite so kittenish as usual. She was giving herself a dress rehearsal this morning of the new part, and was almost matronly. "You loved them, Bobby, such dears, and Bobby." She held up a warning finger and twinkled it mysteriously. "I've asked my adorable Patricia Livingstone to come with her mother. We've been so anxious to see you as two together. You'll be enchanted with her." Bobby grinned amiably and said he was going to be happy to meet them all, especially someone his mother considered adorable. It was obvious she was preparing for this event as if it were a coronation, and he was resolved to humor her. God knew it was little enough he had ever been able to do for her pleasure. He would today atone for all his failures to be what she wanted him to be by going cheerfully into an affair which he suspected would establish his utter asshood as a fact beyond controversy in the opinion of any sensible person present. Considering the will, in this instance equivalent to the deed, he later scored up the party to his credit, though he was unable to attend it. Bobby Merrick's decision to request a 4 months' leave had been based ostensibly upon an extended correspondence with Dr. Emil Arnstadt of Vienna. Arnstadt had been long at work on the coagulation cautery project before the Merrick invention was announced. Immediately he had sought full information about it, which was promptly and cheerfully given. Then had sprung up the warmest attachment between them, leading to Arnstadt's ardent hope that Dr. Merrick would come to Vienna for a leisurely conference on their mutual interests. "We have much to give each other," wrote Arnstadt. "It is well we should meet." In the scales alongside Arnstadt's intriguing invitation was an importunate letter from Jack Dawson, down on all fours in supplication. "No small talk, I tell you. To be asked into a conference with Arnstadt, you've got to come. It's equivalent to a command. You've got to come for my sake. You must realize I've never felt decent about the way I came here as the winner of a prize you tossed into my lap. You shouldn't have done it. Of course, as it has all turned out, you've more achievement to your credit than you had written that exam in full for old Appleton, and taking the persimmons you so jolly well deserved. I never had any illusions, old chap, about my winning the first honors and this prize. You handed them over to me because you thought I needed them more than you. I never felt easy about it, but now that Arnstadt wants to do you this honor, don't refuse. It'll make me a heap more comfortable, I can tell you. But these pressing invitations to Vienna were not the actual driving reasons why Bobby Merrick had decided to spend the summer in Europe. The real tug, he was bound to admit, resided in the fact that Helen Hudson was conducting a small party of tourists through Italy and France. He had a hope of meeting her. She was interfering with his work, disturbing him in his sleep, making him restless, absent-minded, distraught. However she might regard him, he must see her again, if to no better purpose than to change the torturing mental picture he carried of her, shamed and hurt by his unintended impudence. Some kind of reconciliation must be attempted. He had accepted his expulsion from his fool's paradise and no longer cherished the notion that he could reinstate himself with Helen. But it would be worth the trip to see her. Let her be indignant, indifferent, or contemptuous. He must dispose somehow of this haunting picture of her hurt and humiliated. He had kept track of her movements through Joyce, who had quite voluntarily confided the essential facts of Helen's sudden departure from Detroit the next morning after the execrable theater party. It was apparent that Joyce had not been informed, and equally apparent that she very much wanted to know what business had drawn her young stepmothers impulsively out to Brightwood that winter afternoon. In Joyce's mind, there seemed an inevitable sequence relating that event to Helen's sudden departure for New York early next day on some unexplained errand. Short of actually putting a thumbscrew on him, Joyce's inquisitiveness to learn how much Bobby knew about it was persistent, ingenious, desperate. But she received small pay for the news she offered as bait. Exactly why Helen Hudson wanted or needed employment badly enough to become a routing agent in the office of the Beaumont and Grayson Travel Bureau, Joyce couldn't imagine. It was so unlike her. She hated routine. She wasn't used to taking orders or keeping hours. She was about as practical as a Persian kitten on a satin pillow. Bobby had had to listen to an inordinate amount of this, astounded at his own patience. Though in his honest moments he reflected that had Joyce not prattled so volubly of her own accord, he would have been obliged to prime her to it. He was thankful enough for her gift of garrulity the day she told him Helen was about to leave the New York office for Cherbourg, and the conductor of a small party.
"Does Joyce annoy you, Bobby?"
demanded Nancy Ashford one afternoon, with her disconcerting directness.
"Oh, not at all,"
he had replied, feeling a bit silly.
"As I thought. She has just been offered an interesting position as a home visitor with the Juvenile Protective League. I shall press her to take it."
Duly pressed, Joyce accepted the new job. On her last day at Brightwood, she cornered him as he was leaving the hospital at 5.
"I won't be seeing you any more, will I?" she said. "I'm leaving, you know."
"Why, that is true," he replied, as if it had not occurred to him before. "You'll be busy, and you know how this ties me up here. I do hope you like your new work. You must let us know how you get on with it, Joyce."
"You couldn't come and see me sometimes? I'm going to be horribly lonely."
It was evident that the speech cost her something. She forced it with an effort.
"Oh, I don't go anywhere. Unsocial as an oyster. This business is cruelly confining. Someday I hope to have a little more time for—"
She laughed, nervously, mirthlessly.
"Don't say any more, Bobby. It's plain you don't want to. Goodbye. I may not see you for a long time."
He took her cool hand and repeated his good wishes. The episode left him uncomfortable. It had been a decidedly awkward situation. Maybe, if old Tommy could be bucked up somehow, Joyce might be willing to give him another try. It was worth looking into. Arriving in New York that Friday morning, the 22nd of May, he was sailing on the Majestic the next day at 4. Bobby had hunted his old friend down and was startled at the change in him. Tommy was seedy, shiny, spiritless, and had skipped patches under his jowls in shaving. Not much wonder Joyce wanted some other employment besides looking after Tommy. They had lunch together and tried heroically to recover their long-lost collegiate mood, but it was rough going. Too much water had gone under the bridge. Too little water had gone into Tommy.
Sometimes.
Masterson furtively pushed a soiled cuff back into his coat sleeve and attempted to steady his leaky spoon.
Sometimes I've had a notion to end it. If I wasn't such a damned coward, I'd have done it long ago.
So, there being at last a definite motion before the house, Bobby discussed it. Masterson was of the artist type that required a deal of encouragement and adulation. It couldn't be laid on too heavily. Tommy had always possessed an almost infinite capacity for absorbing glory, laud, and praise. Unquestionably, Joyce could have kept her man on the rails had she been a little less frugal with his necessary rations of ambrosia. Well, it was high time he had some. Bobby fed him on the rich confectionery of appreciation all day and left him hilariously drunk with it at midnight. Drunk as he ever had been on whiskey. He was going to perk up and show him by the eternal that he had the stuff. He'd been temporarily depressed, but, as Bobby had said, that was naturally to be expected of any man gifted with so sensitive a creative imagination. And he'd been drinking too much, but he could stop it. He would stop it. And there was this hand on it. The worm had turned, and a good deal more like that. Before he turned in, Bobby wired to Nancy. Joyce urgently needed in New York. Stop. Tommy has finished with J. Barleycorn. Stop. Is full of revived ambition. Stop. Demands regular meals, encouragement, companionship. Stop. Strongly counsel her to help him make good. Stop. Put it up to her as important social service. Stop. She will still be working in interest of juvenile protection. Stop. You need not tell her that. Stop. Affectionately, Mr. Fix-It. P.S. And here is hoping for better luck than usual in managing someone else's business. R.M. Suddenly, Sunday afternoon, he was roused from a nap in his steamer chair to a receipt for a radiogram. He smiled with pleasure. Joyce left for New York at noon.
Patricia pants beautifully,
continued Maxine, passing Bobby his cup. Does she indeed?
Batiks.
Bobby's eyes wandered disinterestedly over the headlines on the front page of Le Matin and his elbows.
Any news?
No. But what's this? 7 Americans hurt in a railroad accident near... Oh, my God. Maxine rushed after him as he dashed from the room and found him telephoning for a taxi. For the next 5 minutes, while he frantically tossed a few necessities into a bag, she hovered at his elbow, extracting broken phrases from him. Terrible accident. My best friend. Have to go. Awfully sorry. No, have to go at once.
But, Bobby, my party. Surely. You wouldn't do such a thing to me. Be reasonable. You can start tonight just as well. Oh, I think this is just too cruel. Too cruel.
He wasn't hearing her. Luncheon? Ridiculous. He kissed her wet face and rushed out. There was no time for the sluggish automatic lift. He ran down the stairs. Ordinarily, the deafening roar of the propellers exasperated him, gnawed his insulation off his nerves bit by bit. Today, he was barely conscious of the racket. He had seen nothing on his way to Le Bourget field, and was equally indifferent to the receding landscape as Pierre Lodi tilted up his ship's nose and climbed a steep grade into the clouds for what he boasted that afternoon was the record flight from Paris to Rome. Bobby still clutched the newspaper in his hand, unnecessarily, for he could recite every word. Late last night, Naples-Rome Express wrecked near Ciampino, open switch, 7 Americans among the injured. Mrs. Helen Hudson, conductor of a touring party, fatally hurt. removed to the English hospital on Via Nomentana in Rome. He remembered the place, little hospital. Ardmore, good man, chief of staff, throat specialist. He knew of him. The day dragged on. Sometimes he relaxed from his tension, sank back into the cushions, limp, and wondered how much of a quiver of him was due to the shrimp's temper. Then his anxiety would sweep over him, drying his throat, nauseating him. It was an interminable grind, and it seemed almost as long again to creep in at a 30-mile snail pace from the landing field to the hospital. The taxi turned in at the hospital gate and slowed down as it followed a graveled driveway hedged with masses of shrubbery. It drew up under the porte cochere. He had not remembered it to be such a gloomy, taciturn, forbidding place as it appeared today. He wondered if that was the way Brightwood looked to people who came, heart-sick with anxiety, to inquire whether their beloved still breathed. Chapter 20. Yes, Dr. Ardmore was in, admitted the desk in the lobby, but it was to be doubted if he could be seen. Yes, so very busy today. Mrs. Hudson, she was still living. Would he sit down? The desk was sympathetic. Bobby nervously scribbled a message. "Take that card to Dr. Ardmore," he commanded, "and make sure he gets it." In a few minutes, a stocky, graying man of 45 came quickly down the corridor and reached out his hand. "Yes, I'm Ardmore. Only today we are speaking of you, Dr. Merrick. This is indeed a great pleasure. Now you have come about your countrywoman, Mrs. Hudson, my friend. I fear we are not to save her. No, nothing has been done yet. Too soon. You'll understand. Cerebral concussion. Donnelly must wait a little. He thinks tonight it may be safe to try, but he has no hope. Conscious? Oh, fitfully, partially. We have her quieted, you know. She is aware that she is totally blind. I am sure of that." "Then the contusion covers the occipital lobes." "Exactly. Squarely on the back of the head. Very deep lesion. Then there are the fractured ribs. That's bad, too. Lowers the resistance. Donnelly had decided at noon that it was useless to attempt the head operation, but now he's going into it. He does not see too many of these cases. I could wish, but... My God, man, you're here. You shall do it. Donnelly will be very grateful." Bobby's heart was pounding. "You really think he might want me to?" "Want you? He'll see you're a godsend. Donnelly's an excellent surgeon, but he does not specialize. You'll win his everlasting appreciation. Come, you'll go to your patient. I shall be responsible for Donnelly's full approval. Come, please." "Just a moment, Dr. Ardmore," said Bobby, tugging loose from the arm that was propelling him down the corridor. "I have something to say to you before I see Mrs. Hudson. Let us go into some place where we may talk privately." Ardmore led the way into a small parlor. "I think you ought to know," said Bobby, "that this young woman's life is more to me than professional concern, more than might be implied by the fact that we are fellow countrymen and acquaintances. I have hopes of making her my wife." "My word, what a situation!" "Yes, isn't it? Now, I'll tell you the rest of it. We've had a very serious misunderstanding. That is to say, she is misunderstanding me. That being the case, perhaps it would be much better, in the event she has an interval of consciousness, that she be left unaware that I am her surgeon." "But," objected Ardmore, "why not that fact put a little more resistance into her?" "Not the kind we want." "Well, you ought to know. I shall tell the nurse, and endeavor to keep your identity secret." It was the droop of her mouth that brought the scalding tears to Bobby's eyes. For a moment he thought he couldn't bear it. Ardmore, observing how deeply he was affected, felt some concern. This was not an affair into which an operating surgeon dared to fetch his emotions. He gripped his visitor's shoulder with 5 vice-like fingers and muttered, "Steady. You're her doctor, not her lover." He motioned the nurse to follow him out into the hall and left Bobby alone with his patient. She roused slightly, drew a short, painfully interrupted sigh that made her wince. The lips tightened momentarily and relaxed again into the pensive droop. Bobby took the hand that lay on the white counterpane and held it in both of his. There was the very faintest imaginable pressure in her fingers. Dear little chap. She was at least vaguely aware of a friendly hand clasp, no matter where it came from. That was that much, anyhow. The door opened and Ardmore returned with the nurse whose eyes sparkled. She shared an important secret.
"Perhaps you'd like to make an examination, Doctor," said Ardmore.
Bobby nodded. The nurse led him to a washroom and found him a smock and gloves. The patient was placed in position and temporary bandages were removed. Bobby stood stunned at the sight. It was, as Ardmore had said, very, very deep. He gave a quick, almost inarticulate intake of breath as he touched it. Again, the English doctor's strong fingers gathered up a large handful of his young colleague's shoulder and growled,
"Remember, she's your patient."
"There's nothing to be gained by waiting," said Bobby. "Send for Dr. Donnelly, please. We will go into this as soon as he arrives." It was 6 o'clock when Helen was laid upon the operating table and 7:30 when she was transferred again to the wheeled bed on which she had come. During that hour and a half, Bobby Merrick, led by a supreme effort of his will, was a brain surgeon, and Helen Hudson was a patient. A case of precariously difficult occipital contusion. When they had wheeled her in, he feared for a moment he would be unable to achieve that professional attitude. He hesitated before making his first incision, as he might have hesitated had the scalpel been aimed at his own heart. Once that deft stroke had been accomplished, he was all surgeon. Donnelly stood by attentively, gently sponging away the blood, marveling at the uncanny accuracy with which the veins were clipped with forceps, almost before they had a chance to signal their location, regarding with envious admiration the swiftness and sureness of those slim, strong, experienced fingers. Twice Merrick had glanced up anxiously into the eyes of the anesthesiast. It was no small matter to be conducting either into those pummeled lungs, but apparently satisfied with what he read there, applied himself with renewed concentration to his task. It was a terrific strain, and the little group in the operating room was strangely silent. By common consent, it was understood that a moving drama was being enacted here. A tragedy, perhaps. Any breath might be her last. That would depend upon the skill of the surgeon. Life and death were to be determined here by the promptness and accuracy of decisions in the removal of the clots. Too deep meant death. Not deep enough meant blindness for life. When the operation was all but finished, Donnelly inquired with an entreating look and a hand outstretched for the needle if he might not do the scalp stitches, but Merrick shook his head. The little procession crowded through the door. Bobby walked shakily into the adjacent dressing room, sat down on a white enameled stool, his shoulders slumped, and contemplated his hands. Her blood. Donnelly and a nurse helped him off with his rubber gloves and out of his smock. The impulsive Italian himself insisted on mopping his guest's face with a cold towel, eager to show his sympathy. It had been the most stirring event of his experience in a vacation singularly exposed to dramatic situations. They tried, a little later, to persuade Merrick to eat something, but his dinner consisted of a stiff drink of brandy, which he gulped greedily as a toper. It was useless to argue with him. He was determined to go at once to his patient's bedside and wait results.
"But there's nothing more you can do," expostulated Ardmore. "It will be hours before you can determine anything more than you know now, unless, of course."
"Exactly," muttered Merrick. "It's the unless that concerns me, and the threat of a quick pneumonia." Donnelly and Ardmore went to dinner. As they parted at the hospital gate, the Italian said,
"It's too much to hope for. Our young friend will be deeply grieved. But it was a masterful piece of work."
Her room was in semi-darkness, but Merrick's eyes, once they were accustomed to the gloom, caressed the loveliness of her face. He had not bandaged her eyes. They were closed, and the long black lashes, incredibly long lashes, made heavy shadows on her darkly flushed cheeks. Her breathing was regular, quiet, almost too quiet at times, and he would rise from his chair by the window and move anxiously toward the bed, his nerves keyed to the breaking point. Mostly he sat, resting his elbows on his knees with his chin in his hand, staring at her face, occasionally rousing when a longer breath, exhaled shudderingly, would bring him to her side, his stethoscope intent. About midnight he took a turn up and down the corridor, and upon re-entering the room whispered into Julie Craig's ear, "Is there anything in that closet?"
"Yes, Doctor. Can I help you?"
He shook his head, stepped to the wardrobe, and after some search brought out a soiled and torn blue gown, fumbled at the neck of it, and having found what he sought, restored the garment to the closet and closed the door. Julie Craig watched him interestedly as he sat toying with the bit of jewelry he had abstracted from his patient's clothing. Doubtless it was one of his gifts to her. There was some delicious secret connected with it. She wished she knew. After a while, he rose and, bending over her, whispered, "You may go out and take a bit of exercise. I shall call you if you're needed." Dawn was breaking. The little clock ticked energetically on the bureau. Birds twittered sleepily outside the window. Bells tolled matins. There was a weary sigh from the bed. Julie Craig bent over it solicitously. And then, in that dear voice, curiously like a muted cello, between hysterical little sobs, Bobby's patient murmured,
"Oh, blessed God, I can see."
Chapter 21. Julie Craig was a romantic little thing, and the drama in which she had been assigned a role was quite to her liking. It was not a fat part as to voluminosity of lines, but it kept her almost continuously on the stage in the thick of action. Very thrilling it was to feel herself the chief custodian of so valuable a secret. She had resolved to safeguard it against any hazard until the impressive moment arrived for its sensational release. As for Dr. Ardmore's attitude toward the matter, he was so hilarious that morning to learn of the complete success of young Merrick's operation that it mattered little to him when or how his attractive patient should discover the identity of her benefactor. Ardmore was British. It occurred to him that whatever misunderstandings might have estranged these two interesting young Americans, the machinery of reconciliation was now in good running order. If they couldn't execute some kind of treaty in the face of this theatrical life-saving event, they deserved to go their separate ways without expectation of sympathy. Dinelli, by race and temperament cordial toward the grand opera aspects of the situation, rather hoped the fair patient's identification of Merrick might not be brought about until she was at least sufficiently clear of mind to get a real emotional wallop out of the occasion, and sincerely hoped he might find some good reason to be present when it happened. Julie was for postponing the great moment as long as possible. To her active imagination, it was a situation to be nibbled at, appreciatively, toyed with, cat-and-mouse fashion, savored, rolled about on the tongue. She could not conceive anything more bitterly disappointing than a prosaic anticlimax, now that the dramatic materials were all in hand for a perfectly whopping curtain. It made her shudder to contemplate the possibility of his popping into the room while his idol was in the throes of nausea, as she was almost sure to be a dozen times before the day was out. The whole affair, Julie decided, should be insured against a commonplace outcome, and dedicated herself to that movement with almost as much concern as if she were one of the principals. Pursuant to that determination, she had left word at the office that she wished to communicate with Dr. Merrick as soon as he returned from breakfast and the brief nap he had promised himself. When the message came up that the young American surgeon was in the building, Julie went to the stairs to meet him. He greeted her warmly, told her she had been very faithful, suggested she would be better off for a few hours' sleep. He would see to it that she was relieved at once. She shook her head.
"I'm not sleepy. I shall wait until this afternoon. Dr. Ardmore told me my patient was not to know who was treating her, so I have restored the bandage to her eyes. I told her they should not encounter the strong light for several hours. I hope I haven't done wrong, sir."
"You're very resourceful," said Bobby, endeavoring to keep a straight face. "Is there, by any chance, something else I ought to know before looking in?"
She colored with conscious pride. "Yes, sir. If you don't mind,
I have told her that since she does not speak Italian fluently, whatever conversation she may have had with you is to be interpreted by me, and Dr. Donnelly can be asked in this morning while you make the examination. Is that agreeable?
Miss Craig, said Bobby solemnly, you're wasting your talents here. You should belong to the diplomatic corps.
I hope you're not making fun, sir. Dr. Ardmore said she wasn't to know, and I saw no other way of keeping it from her.
You've done very nicely, commended Bobby. I'll wash up and change my coat.
Helen had been creeping out of her etherized torpor at closer intervals of full consciousness since 7, had even smiled gratefully under Julie's little tenderness. So glad, she had murmured when Julie assured her she was going to be well and sound as ever. And I can see. She raised a white hand and tugged weakly at the edge of the bandage over her eyes. Julie hastened to restore it. Tomorrow, perhaps, she promised. He wants them protected today. Very well, with an obedient sigh. He ought to know, I suppose. Julie was a tense little figure when Dr. Merritt came in, arrayed in his borrowed surgical gown, accompanied by the volatile Donnelly, who greeted her with a bombardment of praise for having contributed so much to this happy eventuality. She returned a volley warning him against an accidental disclosure of their secret. Donnelly nodded vigorously and chuckled. Dr. Merrick stepped at once to the bedside table, consulted the chart, and proceeded to verify the latest pulse count. Please tell the doctor, said Helen slowly, that the bandage around my chest is so very tight. Could he make it more comfortable? Julie dutifully relayed the request in swift Italian sentence composed of one word or 200 syllables, mostly vowels. Seeing that the surgical bandage around her chest had been Donnelly's affair, it was only a natural courtesy for Dr. Merrick to permit his colleague to decide whether or not he wished it changed. Stepping back, he silently signed to Dr. Donnelly that this matter was up to him. But Donnelly vehemently protested with outspread fingers that he was only too eager to discover his guest's technique. The opportunity for a debate not being favorable, Bobby turned down the sheet, examined the broad bandage, unpinned it, unfolded it down to the creamy white satin skin, carefully inspected the discolored field of the fractures, and expertly replaced the bandage. Oh, that is ever so much better, sighed the patient gratefully. Julie shook loose a cascade of musical Italian, and the doctor grunted his receipt of it. He has very gentle hands, murmured Helen sleepily. Shall I tell him that, madame? Asked Julie, her eyes brightly searching his face. No. Tell him I am thankful he has made me see again. Impulsively, Bobby entertained a foolhardy notion. In a clumsy Italian phrase remembered from boyhood, he mumbled something about the pleasure being all his own, and, dismayed by his own audacity, walked to the window to write a prescription. Julie's eyes were intent upon her patient's half-covered face. She was about to interpret the doctor's remark when she noted that the full lips parted, then that the lower lip was gently pinioned between an even row of white teeth, while the dimples deepened ever so little in a slow flush across her cheeks. With agitated fingers, Julie refastened the smock at the throat, her sentimental little heart beating wildly. She knows, thought Julie. Bending over her, she said gently, But perhaps you understood what the doctor was just saying? Is that not so? There was no reply. She had drowsed off again, but the smile lingered on her lips and the flush lingered on her cheeks. As they went out, Dr. Merrick beckoned Julie to the door and said in an undertone, You might remove that bandage from her eyes while she sleeps. It will be more comfortable. 2 hours later, she roused again, having soberly regarded Julie for some minutes. She fumbled at the neck of her smock and drew out the silver little cross. Holding it tightly in both hands and pressing it to her heart, she inquired, "How did you know I wanted it?" "I did not know, madame, or you should have had it from the first." There was a long pause. "When did you put it on me? I just now discovered it." "I did not put it on you, madame." There was another long silence. Observing that her patient was dabbing clumsily at her eyes with the corner of the sheet, Julie hastened to restore her handkerchief, then turned and walked thoughtfully to the window. "Did you see him do it?" Julie did not turn from the window as she replied unsteadily, "No, madame. He invited me to leave the room." "The poor dear." At 9 that evening, Marion Dawson arrived and Bobby met her at the station. Immediately upon reading news of the accident, she had been fortunate in making connections with the best westbound train of the day. Her frantic telegram of inquiry, addressed to the hospital when en route, had been handed to Merrick, who had wired reassuringly to her train. She had received the message at 10. It did not greatly surprise her to have a telegram from him, knowing that he would have been likely to see the account of the disaster while in Paris. "Oh, Bobby, how wonderful!" she exclaimed tearfully when he told her that everything was favorable to a prompt recovery. "Can I see her?"
"Better not tonight. She will be brighter in the morning."
"And I suppose you two blessed things have found that you're necessary to each other, haven't you?"
"Well, not yet," he said hesitatingly. "You see, I have her at a rather awkward disadvantage. I performed the operation myself. I don't wish to make capital of any obligation she might feel toward me. In fact, she doesn't know I'm here at all." Marion was pink with indignation. The taxi driver stood by the open door of the cab, waiting for them to step in, but she ignored the gesture and blazed at her compatriot angrily.
"Bobby Merrick, I think that's simply disgraceful. You always kept the dear soul in the dark and made her feel irresponsible, and here you are again with some more of your wretched secrets. Well, we'll see if you're going to use her that way this time. When I see her in the morning, I mean to tell her. You don't need to think I'm a party to any more of these mysteries." He rather suspected that she meant it. On the short ride over to the Quirinal, where he had reserved a room for her, he told her as much as he could explain of the operation, attempting to divert her attention from her annoyance over his attitude towards Helen.
"I am leaving in the morning for Vienna," he said, after making sure she was receiving proper attention at the hotel desk. "Dr. Donnelly can do the dressings as well as I. There's no danger now, and no reason for my staying on, especially since you seem bent on informing her."
"It's the only decent thing to do," retorted Marion obduratedly. "She has a right to know. Well, give my love to Jack and tell him I'll be back when Helen doesn't need me anymore. I wonder if she'll forgive me."
"I hope so, my dear. But I wouldn't bet much on it. Goodbye." Later in the evening, he had a consultation with Donnelly and felt confident he was leaving his patient in competent hands. He stepped into Helen's room, found her sleeping, took her hand and held it for a moment, and walked out with only a nod for the nurse who had relieved Julie. At the desk, he scribbled a note for her, thanking her for her exceptional faithfulness and originality, and enclosed a substantial tender of gratitude, part of which she used to defray a 3 months' vacation in Switzerland. Reconciliation was effected promptly and silently the next morning when Marion called. They kissed each other and wept a little. Julie excused herself and left them alone together.
"Helen, dear," whispered Marion, the moment the door had closed, "you could never guess who did your operation."
"Oh, yes, I could," drawled Helen, smiling.
"Good. He thought he had such a secret. When did you find out?"
She laughed with a little wince of pain.
"He talked some Italian for me yesterday." "And you recognized his voice?" instantly. He doesn't know it. I am confident. Well, he probably will before the day is over.
Before Marion had a chance to reply, Dr. Donnelly came bustling in, trailed by Julie, and smilingly approached the bedside. Helen looked up inquiringly. "Isn't Dr. Merrick coming this morning, Miss Craig?" Julie shook her head. "He left for Vienna at 7, dear," said Marion. "I told him I intended to tell you he was here, so off he goes." "How like him," said Helen, smiling. Chapter 22. Dr. Merrick's unusual capacity for pinpoint concentration upon problems of scientific research was not quite up to par during his collaboration with Dr. Arnstadt. The Viennese surgeon seemed every way satisfied and rejoiced in his close association with his young American colleague, but Bobby was too restless and distracted to make the most of his opportunity. Jack Dawson had been quick to understand his friend's mood. "Bobby," he advised one early August night, as they were finishing their dinner in the low-ceilinged grill room at Hangel's, "I don't want to meddle, but I believe you really ought to run over to Imperial City and do your stuff. You're getting to be damned poor company, and I think you have something weighty on your conscience." Bobby nodded soberly. "You're right. I'll go tomorrow." Marion had stayed on in Rome. Jack's daily letter from her constituted the log of Helen's rather tedious trip through convalescence. It was a great day in Vienna, demanding a bit of celebration that night, when the news came that she had sat up for half an hour. Now that she had been wheeled out into the shady patio, now she had taken a short walk. Now they were both at Quirinal, and every afternoon Helen was down in the garden, in the hotel court. Now she was taking drives in the evening. You could hardly find the scar anymore. Helen was so happy. On the morning of the 6th of August, Jack and Dr. Arnstadt saw Bobby off. After the train had slipped quietly out of the station, Jack went to the telegraph booth and wired to Marion. He did not tell her it was a secret that Bobby was on the way. She would not have kept it in any event. She was all done with riddles. "Who do you think's coming?" she cried, romping into Helen's room, waving her telegram. "When does he arrive?" "Tomorrow afternoon, about 6. Isn't it wonderful?" "I'm going, dear. I don't feel quite up to it." "Why, the very idea! You can't. When you know he's on the way, he'll be wretchedly disappointed." "But I don't know he's coming. That is, not officially. He probably didn't want me to know, or he would have informed me." There was no talking her out of it. She was going. That night they paid a farewell call at the hospital. Julie Craig shyly inquired of Mrs. Dawson if Dr. Merrick was still in Europe, and was appalled to learn that he was arriving in Rome tomorrow. "But you will have gone, madame," exclaimed Julie, looking reproachfully at her patient. Surely this affair was being badly managed by somebody. All that the concierge at the Quirinal seemed to remember at first about the whereabouts of the two young American women was that they had left that noon for Paris. Upon further reflection and an appreciation of the color of the banknote which Dr. Merrick was twisting in his fingers, he recalled that Madame Hudson's heavier baggage had been expressed directly to Le Havre. He had himself seen to it. Yes, she was sailing on the Ile de France on Thursday. At all events, her trunks were. Bobby spent an hour pacing up and down the flagging in the garden at the Quirinal, planning his next move. This game of hide-and-seek mustn't go on any longer. He resolved to corner her and take her by force. He sent a long telegram to Jack Dawson, confiding the full particulars of the enormous audacity he had decided to commit. He had made his reputation with her by various acts of impudence. This would be the crowning deed which would make all his former impertinences seem bland. He was very nervous as he prepared for it. Events moved very swiftly once he had come to his decision. He engaged an aeroplane and flew to Paris. Between the racket of the triple engines and the furious pounding of his heart, it was a noisy trip. There was a hasty half-hour with his mother, in which he persuaded her to forgive him on the strength of a promise that he would return and be with her at Christmas. At the downtown office of the French line, he engaged the most luxurious suite on the Ile-de-France. Next morning, he flew to Havre, arriving an hour before the boat train from Paris. It was a long and anxious hour. Never had he been so utterly stampeded by his own emotions. Seeing to it that his light luggage was in his quarters, and having strolled about through the commodious suite to make sure it was ready for occupancy, he had retained enough presence of mind to order the place filled with flowers. He went up to the captain's cabin, renewed acquaintance, and asked a favor. Then he went down and took his stand at the foot of the first-class gangway, waiting with an impatience almost too urgent to be borne. Whatever would she think? Slowly the train crept into the shed, across the way, and the passengers swarmed in little groups about their hand baggage. Presently, the procession began to move stragglingly towards the ship. Bobby saw her coming, tripping smartly along with two porters attentively close behind her. Mauve. This time. Snug. Saucy. Close hot. Mauve. A tailored suit of mauve that sculpted every curve of her. She sighted him waiting for her. He knew she had seen him. Now her eyes widened and her lips parted as their gaze met. She advanced steadily towards him with the tread almost martial. As she neared him, he did not extend his hand, as she had thought he might. He held out both arms, and, to his inexpressible delight, she walked confidently into them, shyly laid her slim fingers on his coat lapels, looked up into his face, and smiled.
"Put Madame's baggage in suite B,"
said Bobby, in a proprietorial tone to his porters.
"You are traveling with me," he explained rather unsteadily. "The captain is marrying us this afternoon."
"Yes, dear," she said softly. "I know." Bobby's arms tightened around her.
"How did you know?" He grinned boyishly.
"Well, let's see. You wired it to Dr. Dawson, and he wired it to Marion, and she wired it to me. Awfully roundabout way to learn one was being married, wasn't it?"
But you're for it, aren't you?" he pleaded, searching her eyes. She smiled. "Perhaps we should go aboard, Bobby. We're blocking the traffic." The end.